Excellent. Okay, so without further ado, science communication as collective intelligence. So in the UK, it's probably about a decade or so that it's become a sort of standard component of the job of an academic to also do significant amounts of outreach and science communication. And even pre-pandemic, I had a number of concerns about this development. One of these, and probably the least of these, is that doing that properly is time consuming and resource intensive. And scientists, of course, already faced significant pressures before they did this additional task. But more importantly, I think it's clear that the best communicators are unlikely to also be the best scientists, even though there are some notable exceptions. And that has a number of unfortunate consequences. One of these is that what is communicated is not necessarily representative. So the people you most likely to see on talk shows and news programs in your scientific field are probably by and large not the people that you would have voted as the sort of intellectually best representatives of your field. And as a result, it's often also not representative of the field at large, what's being said there. And I think there's sort of demonstrable evidence over the last decade or so that this increased emphasis on science communication itself has given rise to sort of feedback loops that go back to distort the scientific process itself. So somebody can write in a really good pop science textbook or give really good TED Talks with oversimplified narratives, and they will themselves then kind of feed back into the review process and potentially hamper actual science. So I think there were issues there already pre-pandemic, but the pandemic really brought these issues to a head because obviously the pandemic put sort of unprecedented pressures on time and resources for any individual experts who were involved in communicating science to either the policy community or to the public. And at the same time of these unprecedented pressures, there was also unprecedented scrutiny and in many cases unprecedented responsibility, given that you were literally advising on high stakes issues that were a matter of life and death. But that also was unfortunately coupled with unprecedented levels of aggression, threats of violence, misogyny, and racism to individuals that sort of were willing to stick their head above the parapet, engage in these processes. And also, the longer the pandemic went on, the more it became clear that scientists were facing also orchestrated, well-funded campaigns of anti-science aggression of the kind that we'd previously seen only in the climate context, which gives rise to this kind of David versus Goliath kind of dynamic. So this just proved unsustainable for many individuals, and very many well-meaning people who started out contributing early on the pandemic just withdrew from this process altogether. And I think it's also obvious that to kind of deal with these threats and difficulties, we need to throw more resources at the problem. In particular, the obvious solution, I think, is bringing in the wider community of scientists, which would allow us to sort of replace the vulnerability of the sort of lone individual with the sort of broad shoulders of an entire scientific community. And that's also essential with respect to the quality of what's being communicated there, because only that will bring the sort of necessary diversity of breadth of perspective, which is essential not just for fairly and accurately representing the state of the art in the science, but also for a reason that Beth Novak already mentioned earlier, is that science needs to be applied in actual particular contexts, and that typically involves an understanding of what those contexts are. So in the pandemic, behavioral sciences were at the forefront early on before we had vaccines or therapeutics. But you can't just take a textbook on risk communication or behavior change and apply that without understanding something about the nature of the particular community that you're speaking to. So we need scientists that represent all of these communities to even allow these kind of translation processes. So given those pressures, I think it was unsurprising that the pandemic saw what I think could be described fairly as a sort of tacit move to collective intelligence in a number of strands that weren't themselves new, but I think that certainly sort of evolved and became amplified by the pandemic. So for one, there was a whole range of ad hoc groupings that were formed by learned societies to dispense advice and create materials both for policymakers and the general public. In my area, the Association for Psychological Sciences in the US, or the British Psychological Society. The Royal Society and the German National Academy of Science Leopoldina also formed large interdisciplinary bodies of scientists, in the case of the Leopoldina, by drawing on its members, in the case of the Royal Society, by having sort of open recruitment drives where well over 1,000 scientists could volunteer to be part of a modeling group and were then selected. But we also saw sort of self-selected groups of scientists forming their own policy bodies, typically to sort of counter what were perceived to be mistakes occurring in the official sort of policy process and governmental decisions. So in the case of the United Kingdom, the main policy body, which is in fact a body of bodies, SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, came under scrutiny early on in the pandemic, in good part for a lack of transparency. And there was a self-selected interdisciplinary group of scientists called Independent SAGE, who started producing weekly COVID briefings that are still running to this day, that were streamed on YouTube and were accompanied with a significant Twitter presence. And this was replicated both in Australia and Canada. Scientists also clubbed together to do TikToks. And of course, maybe the prime example of this was COVID Science Twitter itself. So in previously unprecedented levels, Twitter was used to discuss the new science as it emerged, as the evidence base changed over the course of the pandemic. Preprints were scrutinized, policy suggestions were dissected, and so on. Twitter being Twitter, that was not without dysfunction, and the effects of that were probably not uniformly good, in the sense that people suddenly saw how the science process actually works, which is a good thing. But there were also things about that process that probably damaged the public's trust in that very process, which illustrates how carefully we have to think about the sort of design decisions that we make there and how we conduct this kind of discourse. But there were also attempts to directly take a sort of collective intelligence approach. So in March 2020, a bunch of colleagues and I formed an initiative called SciB, which was aimed at trying to bring into the policy process in a useful way behavioral scientists like myself, who'd previously just spent 20 years sitting in an ivory tower doing fundamental research, and trying to basically turn our research and our skills into something that would be useful for combating the pandemic. And our idea for that was that we needed this initiative specifically for creating digital tools for transparent, knowledge creation, aggregation, and dissemination, with the goal of fostering this wider, transparent, collective response by scientists in our field. And though we didn't think about it at the time, that could have come straight out of a textbook definition of what collective intelligence is, and provided to us by organizations such as Nesta. So I want to say a little bit about the things that we did to motivate the general point I want to make about science communication going forward. So we started by creating this simple integrated environment at sciB.org, which consisted of a Twitter account, 3 subreddits, and a behind-the-scenes dynamic database project. So the Twitter account, which I ran for 2.5 years, was an information account. So the goal of this and the point of this account wasn't to be just another participant in a debate, but literally actually just to filter information on Twitter that was relevant to behavioral scientists and that was of high quality, and post that to followers of this account who are behavioral scientists as an information resource. In order to kind of foster discussion about studies, new experiments to design and so on, but also to think about how on a meta level to reconfigure what we were doing as scientists, we've set up 3 Reddits. one for research, one for meta-science, and a third one that allowed members of the general public to pose questions to this community of behavioral scientists. And all of this input was aggregated using automated tools into this online dynamic database where entries were then also annotated by sort of an army of undergraduate volunteers. Now, when we started doing this, we were warned at the time by very smart people that a lot of this would be going against sort of the very grain of how we actually do science at the moment. And of course, it wasn't going to be possible for us to overturn all of these kind of structural roadblocks in our discipline itself. So it's not a surprise that a lot of this had very limited impact, particularly as we had no external funding or resources to do this. But I do want to talk about two more projects, one that actually did have impact and one that I hope will. So the project that we conducted that was successful is in the sense that we produced a resource which was endorsed by a wide variety of organizations, including the WHO, and actually used by healthcare workers in actual practice, was this COVID vaccine communication handbook, which is a practical guide that was trying to provide best practice recommendations for how to conduct conversations with people who are worried about vaccination, best practice in light of state-of-the-art behavioral science. The handbook is a downloadable PDF, which we also translated into quite a wide variety of languages. And the handbook itself lives in a wider wiki that allowed users, and does to this day, to read up on further information that was relevant to points made in the handbook, but that talk about the science behind things. So the handbook was an exercise in collectively building a scientific consensus document that followed on from an earlier such attempt by Steve Lewandowsky and colleagues, who produced in 2020 something called the Debunking Handbook, which was a handbook aimed at helping people combat climate misinformation. Now, this parallel is no coincidence, because Steve Lewandowsky was one of the core members of SciBe as an initiative. What I want to highlight in this context is that the Debunking Handbook also had a very interesting pre-registered process for identifying relevant experts in a field, recruiting them and assigning them to topics. That's discussed in the reference given here. For our vaccine communication handbook, which we produced literally in the space of weeks, we didn't have time for such an elaborate process, so we took shortcuts there, but we did add this wider wiki environment. The second thing I want to tell you about, and the final thing, is our manifesto. So in the summer of this year, we produced a manifesto for science communication as collective intelligence, which itself was produced via a collective intelligence process. So specifically, we ran a workshop on this topic in November last year, where we had speakers with expertise relevant to the topic, and we also had participants engaged in all kinds of discussions. In that workshop, we used Polis as a tool to get people to identify important themes and issues. We then, after the workshop, evaluated those themes. Workshop members were invited to volunteer for the writing of this manifesto. So they were recruited from that workshop. And we assigned, we went through the themes, voted on those initially and organized them. And then we assigned groups of volunteers to write text for a long form article on these individual themes in a kind of puzzle piece format. So each group just wrote something on a certain subset of things. Once we had assembled this text of many pages, we used an online tool, Quillbot, to extract the key propositions, and these key propositions were then put again to the vote, and everything that passed a certain threshold of endorsement became a statement in this manifesto. So where is this all going? I think the point I really want to make, and the point that all of this was just supposed to sort of illustrate and motivate, is that the pandemic, like nothing else, certainly nothing else in my lifetime, illustrated the enormous power of science as a collective process. And that includes specifically the development of tools to manage that process, right? There were hundreds of thousands of articles on COVID generated at incredible speed. And with that came the deployment of sort of state-of-the-art machine learning tools and text tools for creating scientific databases to deal with that, and tools that impressively were better at the time than Google was in terms of retrieving the relevant literature. But what didn't really happen, and I think what should happen going forward and should happen regardless of whether there's a pandemic or a crisis situation or not, is that I think we should need to bring the same kind of collective approach to science communication itself. We have incredibly sophisticated computational tools for information extraction and knowledge aggregation already. This is echoing just something that Beth Novak said earlier. And we can combine these with CI principles to support fit-for-purpose collective communication. We also have in computational social science a whole body of research and a whole bunch of skill sets that could directly underpin this process. And so we have the science of science now as a field that I think can directly help us support and design the appropriate systems for these kinds of communications. And we can harness computational social science tools to provide real-time detailed insights about information propagation and opinion dynamics in a way that would allow us to target communications to emerging and important issues in particular communities. Having said that, I think we also need to do work and serious research on new ways of communicating a scientific status quo. There are many contexts in which a consensus document is an appropriate way to go and where a consensus can be found, but there's others where the science is much more uncertain and more controversial. And for that, there are formats that have been tried, such as Chicago booth-style votes and polls. But I think there's also tools such as argument maps, which we've been doing some research on, that could be brought to bear in this kind of context. And finally, I think we need to build a science Twitter that isn't Twitter and that doesn't have Twitter-like dysfunction. And for that, we really need much more fundamental research in online dialogue and online communication to identify the properties that would make such a system possible. So to wrap up, the take-home message is I would really like to see going forward that we make science communication a focal point for CI, and that we treat science as both a subject and an object of CI development, because that will, I think, provide unique opportunities both for transformative practice of science communication itself and for CI as a discipline. So I'd like to thank you for listening, thank my co-authors and also partners in crime at SciB's numerous student volunteers, and the DFG, who now finally have given us some funding to pursue this work. Thank you very much.